Jonathan, you write in this week's cover piece for the magazine that Europe is approaching a boiling point as gang violence is rising up across several countries. I want to start by asking you about the recent riots in France. What's it been like living there?
Well, in our village it's been utterly unremarkable, except that the conversation in the cafe is one of enormous annoyance that this should be happening yet again. France is in an almost perpetual state of rioting and attacks, but this was unusually severe, and it was provoked by the death of this 17-year-old boy in a suburb of Paris who was shot by the police refusing to stop for a control. And a bit like George Floyd in America, a person who did not have an unimpeachable character. Nahel also was involved with gangs. He had 14 previous encounters with the police, but his killing was enough to provoke an insurgence, really, across France in these banlieues, terrible suburbs that surround every French city. And it went on for several days. Hundreds of police have been injured. A number of people have been killed. The government initially appeared paralyzed, but with the police action, it seems for the moment to have subsided. But although it's subsided, the low-level intensity of gang violence in France continues, and the fundamental problems are not solved. No politician seems to have a clue what to do about it, and sadly, the prospect is that it could become worse.
Jonathan, you write in your piece that, like many riots across many countries, there will be some people who are actively pursuing a sense of social justice, but there will be other groups who are trying to capitalize on the moment and cause chaos. What's the balance like at the moment in France?
I would say that most of the really violent action was committed by opportunists and gangs, because looting a shop or burning down a supermarket or a Renault dealer is not really a form of protest. That sort of violent behavior is more classified as a sort of insurrection or a criminal opportunism. There are those who've protested the situation, but even there's some questions, just exactly what the circumstances were, and it will remain for the criminal justice system to determine exactly what happened.
Andrew, what do you make of Macron's response to these riots?
Well, he survived them. He survived the Gilets jaunes, which were much more extensive demonstrations and pretty violent in Paris and other big cities for a while. He survived the anti-pension reform demonstrations as well. He saw them off, and he's seen this off. It's all beginning to peter out. There was a lot of sort of excited coverage, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon media, including, may I say, the Spectator online, that France was on the brink of civil war and riots that would bring down the government and the army would have to be deployed. It was all stuff and nonsense. These things happen. There isn't a country in Europe that isn't one police shooting away from serious riots. I mean, this could happen in every major city in Europe, even this country, where our race relations are pretty much better than anywhere else. It could even happen in a place like Malmö in Sweden. It could happen in Germany. It happened in Belgium. It spilled over. It could certainly happen in Italy. It was never going to be a threat to the government itself. The riots were serious. There were a lot of violence. There's an underclass has been created. Many of us saw it coming years and years ago, but nothing was done about it. And this underclass in the banlieue, in the ghettos, in the poorest suburb exists in a mixture of welfare dependency and quite violent criminality. And how you deal with that, because we've dealt with it basically by just shutting it off there. But although it's a serious social problem, it is not a threat to the state. It's an embarrassment to the state. It's an expensive danger to the state because all these businesses have to be rebuilt. But when revolutions are not built on riots in which the average age of the people arrested is 17. The reason why les événements in 1968 were far more significant was it wasn't just the students who were rioting in major cities and going for revolution. The unions joined in. The working class joined in as well. That was a threat to the state. Now, de Gaulle saw it off in the end. This was not a threat to the state. It was a symptom an insurgency of a deep-rooted social problem that has taken place, that has allowed an underclass to take roots of a particular ethnic and migrant background in the most generous welfare state in the world. So if it can happen in France, it can happen anywhere.
Could I add, I agree with you that it's not a threat to the state itself, but it has left Emmanuel Macron seriously diminished. We recall that when Macron was first elected, he was on the cover of The Economist magazine walking on water, and after the passage of Merkel, his ambition was to become the leader of Europe.
That, can I just remind you, that's also the magazine that had Angela Merkel as the leader of the world. Perhaps not a magazine we should take too much notice of.
Perhaps it's...
What's it called again?
I forget, but
The Economist,
I think we both used to work there, actually.
We did.
But that was when dinosaurs walked the earth. I mean, France, obviously, since 1789 has had this revolutionary tradition, and these latest events were not the most violent. There is an interesting parallel that apparently during these recent riots, animals were freed from the zoo, which also happened in 1789. The difference was that in 1789 they ate the animals. So, but nevertheless, Macron couldn't go to the European Summit on Migration, and now the political centre in France is menaced by the rise of Marine Le Pen, who looks like the favourite to win the next election, but I have to fear that she will only make matters worse because she has no real ideas for how to deal with this. And in fact, across Europe, nobody seems to have a particularly good idea of how to definitively resolve this problem of these areas infested with gangs, infested with crime, with young people completely disconnected from education and opportunity, unemployable, except perhaps in criminality.
Well, let's branch out from France, Jonathan, because in your cover piece you look at disruptions happening in other countries like Germany and Sweden.
Well, particularly Sweden, which is, now the country in Europe with the highest proportion of migrants. In Europe, 25%, a quintessential example of a liberally minded social democracy, and which opened its arms to receive these people, and is now, the police in Sweden, I think, believe there are 38,000 gangsters. They're mostly young. They're incredibly violent. The Swedish criminal justice system is really quite incapable of dealing with them. I talk in my piece about a hitman who killed the wrong person, was sentenced to 4 years in prison, promptly escaped, but was granted Swedish citizenship simultaneously. And now, teachers in Sweden are being told by their students, you're worth 4 years. I can kill you, and I'll only get 4 years for it. So that shows the degeneration of Swedish society into something that is really threatening to its reputation.
Andrew, in Jonathan's piece, he also talks about migration and the potential connection between what's been happening there and the riots. I wonder sometimes, especially when we're looking at asylum seekers and how they're coming into the country, is the issue the systems themselves or a lack of a system? In the UK, for example, there basically is no functioning asylum system. There are very few legal pathways for asylum seekers to come here, only from a few select countries, and you end up in a position where you don't know who a lot of the people coming into the country are. Is the issue a failure of a system or just a complete lack of a system in place?
Well, I don't think it's asylum seekers that are rioting. It's it's migrants, or actually, in the case of France, it's kids who were born in France. They're French, but they don't feel part of French society, and it's quite hard to know exactly what could be done about this. After all, one of the features, the ghetto is an American expression. And one of the features of the ghetto historically, say in the 60s or 70s, was mass unemployment. Well, actually, there's a huge labour shortage in France at the moment. People are crying out for labour. That's true in Britain. It's true in Germany as well. It's even becoming true in Italy. It's certainly true in Sweden that we've been talking about. So it can't be that you have a kind of unemployed youth there. I think a lot of these youngsters have found it culturally more attractive to be involved in low-level crime. than to have a proper job, much to the despair of their parents, who are first-generation migrants and wanted to make it in France or in the countries that they've gone to. So I don't think it's the asylum system. I think it is a problem of assimilating migrants. It's turned out now the Europeans were always terribly superior when they looked at the United States and America's race problems and all the discrimination and the difficulties and so on, and the riots that they had in the 60s in Watts and Harlem and so on. Well, they don't look so superior now because actually Europe, excluding Britain, Europe has proved to be much less capable of assimilating and absorbing large numbers of migrants than America, which is built on migration, or even Britain. And one of the problems that France faces, Germany has it to some extent too, is that the migrant population there, first, second, third generation, particularly in France, are all almost one of a kind. They are nearly all of North African extraction or origin or culture, and they're nearly all Muslim. Whereas if you look at the British migration picture, it's incredibly varied. You know, Christians from Africa, Hindus from India, including our own dear Prime Minister is from there. Muslims, yes, as well. West Indians, Africans, Sub-Saharan, North African, subcontinent, Middle East, Afghanistan, now Ukraine. Much more varied, which therefore means within Britain you get differential performance among migrant groups. So Chinese migrants perform better than anybody, way better than the indigenous white population. Those of Indian extraction perform really well too. Those of Pakistani extraction, less well. But you don't get a kind of uniform picture. Whereas in France, and to some extent in Germany too, because all the migrants have roughly the same background, not all of them, but a lot of them, you get the same problem repeated again and again. Whereas you go to Leicester in Britain, you'll see a thriving migrant city. Go to Rochdale, you see a not so thriving migrant city.
I'd have to say, coming back to England for one of my brief visits, one is slightly encouraged by the different situation in Britain compared to France. I think in France there is really an almost institutional racism. These kids have very little access to higher education. The women are invisible. Whereas I come to London and I see a splendid example of how people can rub against each other and live happily, which is not to say that Britain is necessarily immune.
It may just take one police bullet.
We had, the riots in
Britain
2011.
too.
We've had, there are local difficulties. The idea of a national eruption is somewhat improbable in Britain compared to France.
Well, that's the last question I want to put to you. Andrew, you mentioned this at the start of our conversation, that you think that these kinds of disruptions, these kinds of riots could be set off in other countries. Do you think other European leaders are looking at the situation in France and to some extent Sweden and Germany and thinking we could be next?
Oh, I think there's no question about that. I think every leader in Europe, including I would suggest our own dear Prime Minister, should be thinking this too, that we're all only one police bullet away from a riot, particularly if that police bullet is fired in suspicious circumstances that become hard to defend. Whatever we'll find out in the end.
Or visible on social media.
Yes, and social media has made it much worse.
Social media has made it much worse, and this was demonstrated with George Floyd in America, where these things were propagated. And of course, one of the things that Macron has done is imposed really quite tough censorship on social media for the diffusion of these videos.
Which can certainly backfire if people think things
you'd think this was the action of a totalitarian state, and I'm no fan of Macron, but he has a point that Twitter and Instagram create a kind of mass sort of psychosis in which people see people doing terrible things and imitate it. The final point, though, that I'd like to throw into this is just as in France, we're seeing the rise of Marine Le Pen and her renamed National Front, the Rassemblement National. I think this is going to track Europe more broadly to the right. And we're seeing in Spain there's a general election coming up in which the traditional socialists are being outpaced by a right-wing party. And we see this in Italy, where Meloni is prime minister. She's often described as extreme right. She's not extreme right, but they are right. The problem is that in common with all these right-wing politicians is none of them really have a clue what to do. And they, like all politicians, they think that saying something is the equivalent of doing something. So you're hearing a lot of words. We have to cure this problem. We have to address the issues. But what exactly are the policies?
I mean, Europe's had a lost decade. You know, after the Euro crisis, unemployment rates were, scary among youngsters. I mean, the unemployment rate in Italy among young teenagers reached 40% at one stage. It was a disaster. And I think there's a danger is that Europe now faces a second lost decade too, particularly if the ECB keeps on raising interest rates and tightening money. There'll be another decade of no growth. That makes it very hard to solve problems. I don't say growth on its own solves the problems, but it does make it easier to deal with the problems. There's more money in the treasury to deal with them. That does help. I think the other thing related to France that I find most scary is that these riots, as they have in America, and the cultural significance of America is unbelievable. I don't believe this would be happening in France over the past weekend if it hadn't been for George Floyd in the first place. That set the example of what you do when people in the poorest parts see what they think a racial injustice on the part of the police. You riot, you set fire. And indeed this time, unlike 2005 in France, they went into the city centres. In 2005, they largely stayed rather stupidly burning their own regions, their own areas. This time, they were at the expensive ones. And I think the danger, as this encourages extremes, so Mélenchon on the left has been in there stirring things up. He's a kind of pugilist populist of the left. And of course, as Jonathan says, Madame Le Pen has had a new lease of life. The real danger in France is that the mainstream right and the mainstream left are dead in the water. Macron killed them. They barely exist. But Macron can't run again as president, and I suspect his party falls apart when he goes, that it has no future beyond Macron. So what's the political response? The centre cannot hold, to quote an Irish poet, and the extremes are rampant, and the riots make that worse. I think that's the political danger of what happened in France over the past week.
Andrew and Jonathan, thanks for joining me.